The village was quiet that day, with only the occasional hum of a passing car disturbing the stillness. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a warm golden hue over the narrow streets and the worn-out wooden benches by the bus stop. It was here, at the edge of the village, that a little puppy sat, ears perked and tail wagging with innocent excitement. Max, as he would later come to be known, didn't yet understand that his world had just changed forever. The family car had disappeared over the hill an hour ago, the dust from its tires still faintly settling on the gravel road. Max had chased after it at first, his tiny legs pumping furiously. But the car was fast, and the puppy was too small. He returned to the bus stop panting, his tail wagging with hopeful anticipation. Surely, they would come back. He was their puppy, after all. They loved him. They wouldn't leave him. As the evening wore on, the warmth of the day gave way to the chill of the night. Max's tail stopped wagging as hunger began to gnaw at his little belly. He circled a few times before curling up by the side of the bench, his soft whines barely audible over the gentle rustling of leaves. The stars blinked down at him, indifferent to his plight. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its voice carrying through the empty streets. Max pricked his ears and let out a small yelp in return, but the barking faded, and he was alone again. The next morning, Max woke with a start as a group of children ran past the bus stop, their laughter ringing in the air. His tail thumped against the ground as he looked around eagerly, hoping to see a familiar face. But the road was empty. The car hadn't returned. One of the children noticed the puppy and knelt down, calling to him softly. Max wagged his tail, but didn't move from his spot. When the child reached out to pet him, he sniffed the outstretched hand cautiously before retreating a few steps. The child frowned, puzzled, but soon ran off to join their friends. As the days turned into weeks, Max became a fixture at the bus stop. The villagers began to notice him, their curiosity piqued by the small dog who seemed determined to stay put. An old man who walked past the bus stop every morning started bringing Max scraps of bread. A shopkeeper from the nearby store left out a bowl of water. One rainy afternoon, a kind-hearted woman draped an old blanket over the bench for Max to curl up on. Despite their efforts to coax him away, Max refused to leave the bus stop. He would eat the food they gave him, drink the water, and then resume his vigil, his eyes fixed on the road. Seasons changed. The vibrant greens of summer faded into the burnt oranges and browns of autumn, then gave way to the icy stillness of winter. Max grew from a tiny, fragile puppy into a lean, sturdy dog. His fur thickened to withstand the biting cold, but his eyes never lost their soft, expectant gaze. Each passing car made his ears perk up, his tail twitching in anticipation. But every car that passed by was the wrong one. The villagers began to weave stories around Max. Some said he was waiting for a lost owner who would never return. Others believed he was guarding the bus stop, protecting it from some unseen threat. Whatever the reason, Max's unwavering presence touched their hearts. Children began to call him the bus stop dog, and he became something of a local legend. People who traveled through the village would stop to take pictures of him, marveling at his quiet determination. But Max didn't care about the attention. He didn't notice the stories or the whispers. He was waiting for the only thing that mattered, the return of his family. His gaze remained fixed on the road, his world reduced to the stretch of gravel where he had last seen their car. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky darkened, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drenching the bus stop. Max huddled under the bench, shivering as the wind whipped through the cracks in the wooden shelter. The old man who brought him bread hurried past, calling out to the dog to follow him home. But Max didn't budge. He watched as the man disappeared into the distance, then turned his eyes back to the road. It was empty, as always. But Max stayed. He always stayed. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world fresh and glistening with rain. Max emerged from under the bench, shaking the water from his fur. The villagers murmured among themselves as they saw him, marveling at his resilience. One woman, who had moved to the village only recently, stood at a distance, watching the dog. She had never seen such quiet determination before. Her heart ached for him, though she didn't yet know his story. She made a mental note to ask someone about the strange dog at the bus stop. Max, as always, paid no mind to the people around him. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, his heart full of hope. He didn't know how long he had been waiting. All he knew was that one day, the car would return. One day, his family would come back for him. Until then, he would stay right here. He would wait. The story of Max, the bus stop dog, began to spread through the village like a whispered secret. A tale shared over cups of tea and through fleeting conversations on the way to the market. Everyone who lived there knew him. And even those just passing through took notice of the small, unassuming figure sitting dutifully by the roadside. Max had become more than just a dog. He was a symbol of unwavering loyalty, a quiet presence that tugged at the hearts of those who saw him. In the mornings, as the sun painted the village in hues of gold, the old man who always walked by on his way to the fields would pause to toss a few scraps of bread to Max. The dog would eat gratefully but without fanfare, as though even this simple act of nourishment was just a brief interruption to his true purpose. Max would lick his chops, stretch his legs, and settle back into a spot by the bench, his eyes once again fixed on the road. Children loved Max. On their way to and from school, they would stop to pet him or play near him, giggling as they tried to coax him into chasing a ball or stick. But Max, though he tolerated their games with gentle patience, never joined in. He would wag his tail politely, his gaze occasionally drifting to the road as though he were afraid to miss something important. The children quickly learned to respect his quiet vigil, calling him Guardian Max as they played around him. Tourists passing through the village began to notice Max as well. Some snapped photos of the stoic dog, their curiosity piqued by his story. Shopkeepers were always happy to recount the tale. He's been waiting here for years, you know. For his family never leaves that spot. The tourists would shake their heads in amazement, sometimes leaving treats or water by the bus stop before moving on, their hearts a little heavier for having met him. The villagers began to take it upon themselves to care for Max in small, thoughtful ways. During the sweltering heat of summer, the shopkeeper from the corner store left out a bowl of water under the bench. In the winter, someone would drape an old blanket over the wooden seat to give him a bit of warmth. On rainy days, the baker would send his apprentice out with a scrap of plastic sheeting to shield Max from the downpour. Yet, no matter how much they cared for him, Max never wavered in his purpose. He was grateful for their kindness, but it was clear to everyone that he wasn't staying for them. His heart belonged to someone who hadn't come back. Over time, Max became a source of quiet inspiration for the villagers. His persistence and loyalty resonated deeply with those who came to know his story. People began to see him not just as a dog, but as a symbol of hope. If Max could wait so patiently, so faithfully, then perhaps they, too, could hold on to their dreams and loves, no matter how distant they seemed. There was one man, a widower named Mr. Hartley, who particularly admired Max's steadfastness. He often sat on the bench beside the dog, the two of them sharing a companionable silence as Mr. Hartley stared down the road, thinking of his late wife. "You and me, boy," he would say, his voice thick with emotion. "We're both waiting for someone, aren't we?" Max would wag his tail gently, as if in agreement, then shift his gaze back to the horizon. But not everyone understood Max's story. Some people passing through the village thought it cruel that the dog was left to sit there day after day, his devotion seemingly unreciprocated. A woman from the next town over once tried to take Max home with her, scooping him into her arms and carrying him to her car. But Max squirmed and wriggled free, bolting back to his spot at the bus stop with a determination that left her stunned. She didn't try again, shaking her head as she drove off, her heart heavy with a sadness she couldn't quite explain. Even those who understood Max's story sometimes questioned why he stayed. A young boy once asked his father, why doesn't he just find a new family? His father, struggling to find the right words, finally said, "Sometimes, when you love someone, you wait for them, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else." Despite the years that passed, Max's routine never changed. In the mornings, he greeted the sunrise with a slow stretch and a hopeful wag of his tail. Throughout the day, he watched the road, occasionally wagging at the sound of an approaching car, only to let his tail droop when it wasn't the one he was waiting for. In the evenings, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Max would curl up on his blanket and rest, his body weary but his heart full of hope. Then one evening, a stranger arrived in the village, a woman in her mid-30s, with a travel-worn backpack and kind eyes, took shelter at the bus stop during a sudden storm. She noticed Max almost immediately, his quiet presence impossible to ignore. He was soaked to the bone but didn't seem to care, his eyes fixed on the road as the rain lashed around him. The woman sat beside him, pulling a scarf from her bag to drape over his shivering frame. "Who are you waiting for, boy?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the storm. Max didn't respond, of course, but something in his steady gaze struck a chord deep within her. The storm raged on, and as the rain fell, so did her resolve to move on without knowing more about this extraordinary dog. By the time morning came, the woman had made a decision. She would learn Max's story, no matter where it led her. Little did she know, her curiosity would change both their lives forever. Rachel couldn't shake the image of Max from her mind. There was something deeply compelling about the dog's quiet, steadfast presence at the bus stop. It wasn't just loyalty. It was as though Max was guarding a secret, one that Rachel felt an inexplicable urge to uncover. After spending the stormy night with him, shielding him with her scarf and sharing what little food she had in her bag, she resolved to stay in the village until she learned his story. The next morning, Rachel began her quest for answers. She started at the corner shop, a modest building with a peeling sign that creaked in the wind. Inside, the shopkeeper was arranging loaves of freshly baked bread. When Rachel asked about the dog, his face softened into a sad smile. "Ah, you've met Max," he said. "He's been at that bus stop for years now, waiting for someone who's never come back." "Who was his family?" Rachel asked, leaning against the counter. "Why did they leave him?" The shopkeeper shook his head. "No one knows for sure. All we know is that he was just a puppy when he showed up. Folks say he was left behind by a family passing through the village. They drove off and never came back. Poor thing's been sitting there ever since." Rachel frowned. "Has no one tried to help him? To find out who the family was?" "Many have," the shopkeeper replied, "but Max won't leave that spot. And as for the family, well, people around here don't have the means to go chasing ghosts." Undeterred, Rachel decided to speak with others in the village. She visited the old man who brought Max scraps of bread each morning. Mr. Hartley welcomed her into his home, a cozy little cottage filled with the scent of lavender and old books. Sitting by the fire, he recounted his own observations. "Max is a special dog," he said, stroking his graying beard. "He doesn't just wait, he watches, always looking down that road, as if he knows they'll come back someday." "Did you ever see the family?" Rachel asked. "I did, just once," Mr. Hartley said, his gaze distant. "It was years ago, a young couple with a little boy. They stopped here for gas and some supplies. The boy was playing with Max near the bus stop while his parents packed up their things. Then they drove off, and that was the last anyone saw of them." Rachel thanked Mr. Hartley and continued her search for more clues. Piece by piece, she began to reconstruct the fragments of Max's story, but something didn't add up. Why would a family leave behind their puppy? It didn't seem deliberate. Every account suggested they cared for Max. The thought gnawed at her, and Rachel decided she needed to dig deeper. She visited the local records office, a small building tucked away behind the village square. After explaining her quest to the clerk, she was allowed to sift through old files and documents. It took hours of painstaking research, but finally, Rachel found a lead. A report of a car accident that had occurred just outside the village around the time Max had been left behind. The report described a young family involved in a serious collision. Their car had been struck by a truck on a rainy evening. And though the family had survived, they had been rushed to a nearby hospital in critical condition. There was no mention of a dog. Rachel felt a pang of sorrow as she imagined the chaos of that night. If the family had been injured, perhaps Max had been left behind accidentally, lost in the turmoil. But where were they now? Were they still looking for him? Or had they assumed the worst? With the help of the clerk, Rachel tracked down an address for a relative of the family. It was a long shot, but she felt compelled to follow the thread. She borrowed a bicycle from the inn where she was staying and set off down the winding country roads to find them. The house was a modest, weather-worn cottage nestled at the edge of a forest. An elderly woman answered the door, her eyes wary until Rachel explained why she had come. "You're asking about the Thompsons," the woman said, her voice tinged with sadness. "That was my daughter and her family." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding. "I think I've found their dog, Max. He's been waiting for them at the bus stop in the village." The woman's eyes widened and for a moment, her hand trembled against the doorframe. "Max? You mean he's alive?" "Yes," Rachel said. "He's been there for years waiting." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she invited Rachel inside. Over tea, she explained what had happened. The car accident had left the parents severely injured, and in the chaos, they had believed Max had run off or been killed. After recovering, they had searched for him. But when weeks turned into months with no sign of the dog, they had reluctantly accepted that he was gone. They were devastated, the woman said, her voice breaking. Especially their little boy, Ethan. He cried for weeks, but they eventually moved on. They had no choice. Rachel's heart ached for the family and for Max. She felt the weight of the years he had spent waiting, his loyalty unshaken even when his family had thought he was gone forever. "Where are they now?" Rachel asked. "They moved to the city," the woman said. "I can give you their address if you think it would help." Rachel left the cottage with a heavy heart, but also a sense of purpose. She knew what she had to do. The question was whether Max's family would want to be reunited after so many years, or whether they had closed that chapter of their lives for good. She returned to the bus stop that evening and sat beside Max, running her fingers through his fur. The dog leaned against her, his warmth a silent comfort in the cool night air. "I found them, Max," she whispered. "I found your family." Max, of course, didn't understand her words, but his gaze remained fixed on the road, as if he already knew that something was about to change. Rachel watched him and made a silent vow. No matter what happened next, she would make sure Max found the closure he deserved. The first step would be to contact his family. Rachel felt a nervous anticipation growing within her as she prepared to make the call that would set everything in motion. Rachel didn't waste any time. The next morning, she made the call to Max's family, her heart pounding as the phone rang. A woman answered, her voice cautious but kind. Rachel introduced herself and explained why she was calling. At first, there was silence on the other end. Then, in a voice choked with emotion, the woman said, "Max? He's alive." Rachel's throat tightened as she heard the raw disbelief in her voice. "Yes," she said softly. "He's been waiting for you all these years. At the bus stop where you last saw him." The woman, who introduced herself as Claire, began to cry. She explained that her family had spent months searching for Max after the accident, but when every lead turned cold, they'd assumed he had either been taken in by someone or lost forever. Ethan, their son, had been heartbroken. He had grown up believing he'd never see his beloved dog again. Rachel could hear the mixture of hope and hesitation in Claire's voice. "We're in the city now," she said. "It's been years. Will he even recognize us?" Rachel hesitated. "I think you should come see for yourself. He's been waiting all this time. I don't think he's ever forgotten you." After arranging for Claire and her family to visit the village in a few days, Rachel returned to the bus stop where Max sat as usual, watching the road. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur. "They're coming, Max," she said. "Your family is coming." The following days felt like an eternity. Rachel decided to take Max home with her temporarily to prepare him for the reunion. It wasn't an easy task. Though Max allowed her to lead him away from the bus stop, he walked reluctantly, his head turning back to look at the road every few steps. Rachel's heart ached as she saw the conflict in his eyes. Even as he stepped into her small cottage and sniffed around the unfamiliar space, he seemed unsettled, his loyalty still tethered to the spot where he had waited for so long. Rachel did everything she could to make Max comfortable. She laid out soft blankets for him, filled a bowl with fresh water, and cooked a warm meal. Max ate quietly, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he wasn't sure what to make of this new life. That first night, Rachel stayed up late, watching him from the couch as he curled up near the door, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Even in sleep, his ears twitched at every distant sound, as if he were listening for the familiar rumble of a car engine. In the days that followed, Rachel took Max on walks around the village. She hoped to distract him, to show him there was more to life than the endless waiting. At first, Max was indifferent, plodding along beside her with little interest in the world around him. But slowly, small changes began to appear. He started sniffing at trees and wagging his tail at passing dogs. Once, he even barked at a squirrel, startling himself and Rachel into laughter. Despite these moments, Max remained tethered to his old habits. Every evening, after their walk, he would sit by Rachel's front door, staring out at the road. Rachel tried to coax him inside, but he refused to move until the stars were high in the sky. She began to realize that Max's loyalty wasn't just a habit. It was a part of who he was. His love for his family had shaped him, and no amount of comfort or care could erase that. Rachel found herself growing more attached to Max with each passing day. She admired his quiet strength, his unshakable resolve. She couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be capable of the same kind of love and devotion. Max had waited for years, enduring rain, snow, and scorching heat, all because of a bond that had never wavered. It was humbling, and it made her want to do right by him. When the day of the reunion finally arrived, Rachel felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She brought Max back to the bus stop that morning, letting him settle into his usual spot. He seemed at ease there, his body relaxing as he resumed his vigil. Rachel sat beside him, her hand resting on his back as they waited. Hours passed, and then, in the distance, a car appeared. Max's ears perked up, and his tail gave a tentative wag. As the car grew closer, his posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing with focus. The car slowed to a stop, and the door opened. A boy stepped out, now a teenager but with the same wide eyes and familiar features. "Max!" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Max froze for a moment, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he sprang to his feet and raced toward the boy. Ethan dropped to his knees, throwing his arms around the dog as tears streamed down his face. "It's you. It's really you." Claire and her husband emerged from the car, their faces a mixture of joy and disbelief. They joined the reunion, kneeling beside their son to embrace Max. The dog barked, wagging his tail furiously as he licked their faces, his joy palpable. The years of waiting seemed to melt away in an instant. Rachel watched from a distance, her chest tightening with emotion. She had grown to love Max, but seeing him with his family, she knew this was where he truly belonged. Max's wait was finally over, and the happiness radiating from him was all the proof she needed. As the family gathered around Max, Claire approached Rachel. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought we'd lost him forever. You gave us back a piece of our family." Rachel smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't do anything. Max is the one who never gave up." That night, as Max lay on a blanket in the back of the family car, his head resting on Ethan's lap, Rachel felt a bittersweet sense of peace. She waved as they drove away, knowing she had done what was best for Max. He was home again, and that was all that mattered. The day of the reunion was bright and clear, as if the world itself had conspired to create a perfect setting for what was about to happen. Rachel stood by the bus stop with Max, who had settled into his usual spot with the same quiet determination he had shown for years. But there was something different about him today. He seemed more alert, his ears twitching at every distant sound, his tail wagging faintly as if he could sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Rachel glanced down the road, her heart pounding in anticipation. She had called Max's family the day before to confirm they were coming, and the excitement in Claire's voice had been unmistakable. "We'll be there," Claire had said. "We wouldn't miss this for the world." Max, oblivious to the emotional storm brewing around him, sat poised and watchful. Rachel crouched beside him, gently stroking his fur. "They're coming, Max," she whispered. "They're finally coming back for you." And then, as if on cue, a car appeared in the distance. The sound of its engine reached them first, a low hum that grew louder as it approached. Max's ears perked up and his tail began to wag in slow, deliberate motions. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the car came into view, its silver paint glinting in the sunlight. The car slowed as it neared the bus stop, and when it came to a halt, Max rose to his feet. For a moment he hesitated, his eyes fixed on the vehicle as though trying to process what he was seeing. Then the door opened, and a teenage boy stepped out, his face pale with emotion, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Max!" the boy said, his voice trembling. Max froze. His entire body seemed to tense as he stared at the boy, his tail motionless. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then, as if a floodgate had burst open, Max let out a sharp bark and bolted toward the boy, his tail wagging furiously. The boy, Ethan, dropped to his knees, his arms open wide as Max barreled into him. "It's you," Ethan sobbed, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "It's really you," Max barked again, his voice filled with uncontainable joy. He licked Ethan's face, his tail wagging so hard it looked like it might fly off. Claire and her husband, stepping out of the car, watched with tears streaming down their faces. Claire knelt beside Ethan, reaching out to touch Max, her hand trembling as she ran it through his fur. "You've grown so much," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But it's you. It's really you." Max barked again, turning to nuzzle Claire before licking Ethan's face once more. His happiness was contagious, filling the air around them with a palpable sense of relief and joy. The years of waiting, the seasons of loneliness and hope, all seemed to melt away in this one perfect moment. Rachel stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold with tears in her eyes. She had grown to love Max in her own way, but seeing him reunited with the family he had waited for so long made every bittersweet emotion worth it. This was his moment, and it was beautiful. Claire finally looked up at Rachel, her eyes red but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "You brought him back to us. We thought we'd lost him forever." Rachel shook her head, smiling through her tears. "I didn't do anything. Max did all the waiting. He never gave up on you." For the next hour, the family stayed at the bus stop. Reconnecting with Max, Ethan couldn't stop hugging him, stroking his fur, and telling him all the things he'd wanted to say over the years. Max, for his part, never left Ethan's side, his joy written in every wag of his tail and every bark of excitement. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Claire stood and looked at Rachel. "We want to take him home," she said softly. "But if you think he'd rather stay here, he belongs with you," Rachel interrupted. "This is what he's been waiting for." Claire nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. "We'll take care of him. I promise." Rachel knelt beside Max, ruffling his ears one last time. "You did it, buddy," she whispered. "You waited, and they came back. You're going home." Max licked her hand, his eyes bright and full of gratitude. Then he turned back to Ethan, leaning against the boy as if to say he was ready to go. As the family drove away with Max, Rachel watched until the car disappeared over the hill. Her heart ached, but it was a good kind of ache. The kind that came from knowing she had helped give Max the ending he deserved. Max had waited 4 long years, and now, at last, his wait was over. The car carrying Max and his family disappeared over the hill, leaving the bus stop quieter than it had been in years. Rachel stood there for a moment longer, her heart heavy with a mixture of joy and longing. She had grown so attached to Max, his quiet strength, and his unwavering loyalty. Letting him go was harder than she had expected, but deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. Max had waited for his family for 4 long years, and now he was finally where he belonged. The village quickly buzzed with the news of Max's reunion. The shopkeeper beamed as he recounted the story to every customer, while Mr. Hartley raised a toast to the bus stop dog who had taught them all the true meaning of love and perseverance. Children who had played near Max ran to the bus stop, only to find it empty, their usual companion gone. But instead of sadness, they carried a sense of pride, knowing Max's story had a happy ending. Rachel visited the bus stop one last time before leaving the village. The spot where Max had sat for so many years felt strangely hollow, but it also carried a lingering warmth, as though his presence still lingered. She sat on the bench, watching the road the way Max once had, her thoughts full of the dog who had changed her life in ways she hadn't expected. She realized that Max's story wasn't just about loyalty. It was about hope and how even in the face of overwhelming odds, love could endure. A few weeks later, Rachel received a letter in the mail. It was from Claire, along with a photo of Max curled up on the couch beside Ethan. The letter described how happy Max was in his new home, how he followed Ethan everywhere, and how their family felt whole again after years of missing him. Rachel smiled as she read the letter, her eyes misting over. Max's journey had come full circle, and knowing he was finally at peace made her heart lighter. She tucked the photo into her journal, a reminder of the dog who had waited and the love that had finally found him. As she closed the journal and looked out her window, Rachel whispered, "Goodbye, Max. Thank you for reminding us all what it means to love." And with that, she let him go, carrying his story with her, a bittersweet memory of loyalty, hope, and home.